This is a really critical day. It's an important moment for all of us. My name is Maritza Silva Farrell. I am the Executive Director of Align, the Alliance for Agrarian New York. About a year ago, we came together with all of you, and we were all in the midst of the pandemic, trying to figure out what to do to ensure that our workforce is protected. Workers from the union side, from the non-union side, were struggling. Employers didn't know what to do. Guidelines weren't even as clear, and things in the state were empty. Every corner of our state was empty. A year later, what we know and what we've seen is that we have lost lives. Over 50,000 workers and community members in our state have passed away. We want to honor those lives today. And as we honor those lives, we have to recognize that the work of this coalition, the Essential Workers Coalition, is giving the ability for workers to come together and organize, to come together to get the protections that they need in their workplace, even today when we know that this pandemic isn't still over. So this is a moment of celebration. This is a moment for all of us to take and say, power of the people can win. When we work together with our elected officials, we're willing to stand up with our communities who are doing the job that they were set to do. So we'd like to start off this press conference inviting invite Senator Gianaris to speak, the champion of this bill, the New York Hero Act. The New York Hero Act, let's remember, is a bill that it passes, actually, now that it's passed, is signed by the governor. This bill will be the only one in the country of this nature. We're doing something huge here. So I'd like to hear from Senator Gianaris. And Senator Gianaris, I want to thank you for everything that you've done to protect our communities and our workers, and for your leadership.
Thank you, Maritza, and thank you to everyone on this call who has worked so hard over the last year to get this bill as far as it's gotten so far. Most of all, thank you to the workers who have come out and told their stories and suffered through the last year. We have had many press conferences, some in person, mostly virtual because of the pandemic. And we have one more step to go in getting this legislation done. It has now passed the Senate twice, it's passed the Assembly, and it is just waiting for the governor's signature. We can finally have the legal protections that workers require. We know that many people died over the last year because of unsafe working environments. Employers that were not taking basic precautions as it relates to PPE usage, social distancing, air filtration, all the things that we know are very common tactics that we use to avoid spread of COVID right now. There were workplaces that were simply not taking appropriate steps to implement those kinds of things over the last year, and people died as a result, many people. This bill would very clearly just set up requirements that the Departments of Labor and Health would set up, that employers would put in place. It would set up workplace committees that employees would be able to use to opine and monitor compliance. And it would go a long way, as Maritza said, towards setting the tone nationally for the kind of measures required to protect people, not just the workers, but also customers at some of these businesses at a time of a pandemic related to an airborne infectious disease. So let's get the last step done. Let's get the governor's signature on this bill, and then we're going to have one last press conference to celebrate the enactment of the law. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator Gianaris. Yes, let's just get one more week, maybe. Let's be optimistic here. All right, so thank you for that. That's actually a really good segue also to elevate the Assembly. Without the leadership from the Assembly and the Senate, today we wouldn't be able to celebrate the passage of this important bill in the legislature. Let me introduce you now to our leader in the Assembly, Assemblywoman Karines Reyes.
Thank you, Maritza, and so happy to be here with you all celebrating finally the passage of this bill in both the Assembly and the Senate. and urging the governor to sign this as soon as possible. Like you mentioned, this would be a model in the country. And what I've realized, not just in the conversations with colleagues and in the debate, and in conversations with family members that I have in other states, there are still many pandemic deniers. And the reality is that these people who deny the existence of this virus are workers, are business owners, are people that are kind of spearheading what happens in a lot of workplaces and how it affects workers and customers and communities as a whole. And what we need is guidelines that are concrete, that are clear for employers to follow, and for workers to have some kind of recourse when their lives are put on the line with employers who don't want to follow the science. And the reality is that this is real and it's been killing many, many people. I've seen it myself on the front lines as a registered nurse. And this is long overdue. Many of our colleagues ask that why are we doing this now, that this is not the time to be hurting businesses. But I argue that we are late in doing this. We should have done this a very, very long time ago. Employers need clear guidelines. They are not scientists. They're not healthcare providers. Many of our industries, restaurant workers, farmers, they have no idea how to protect themselves or their workers from an airborne infectious disease. And it is our responsibility as a government to make sure that we provide those very clear guidelines for them so they can protect themselves. And worker committees are a huge, huge step for us too, because in the private sector, we know that many workers aren't unionized and don't have the recourse of a union to advocate for them, to fight for them, and being able to opine and work along their employers in making sure that these guidelines are implemented is super, super important. And that also is a huge step for workers as a whole, not just within the context of this pandemic, but in labor. So we're very, very happy that this passed, and we're so proud of the work. I have to thank Senator Gianaris for passing it twice in his House, and for all the workers and all the work of the advocates and the unions that co-authored this. And this was really a partnership. I mean, I can't tell you how many calls we've been on almost every week talking about language and how best to implement this. And I'm so happy that it's finally come to fruition. And now it's at the governor's desk, and we urge him to sign it as soon as possible. So thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Reyes, for your leadership and for making this a reality in the Assembly, and for all the colleagues in Albany who have been doing this work with all of us. Thank you for all of them. As you mentioned, we know that workers have been at the front line. Many of us clap for the workers. Many of us put signs in the corners of our homes, and that has been nice. But what we have heard from many workers is that that's not enough. So now we do have an opportunity to really thank our workers, essential workers, and the workers who are right now opening up by ensuring that this law is passed. And that's what Governor Cuomo has to hear. This will protect businesses as much as workers and our communities. This is the right way to go. And someone who has actually been hearing from workers from the start of this pandemic, the same workers who have fed us, who have actually risking their lives, is the leader of the Retail Wholesale Department Union, Stuart Applebaum.
Thank you, Maritz, and thank you for your leadership throughout all of this. When people go to work each day, they should never have to worry that they're putting their lives at risk. But unfortunately, that is exactly what has been happening during the pandemic. Many of my union's members are essential workers. They work in supermarkets and drugstores and nursing homes and in food processing. They went to work every day, even during the worst days, so the rest of us, so society could survive. And they kept going to work, even as others were able to protect themselves at home. Unfortunately, some employers in New York and around the country demonstrated a blatant disregard for the health and safety of their own employees and didn't do enough to protect them. Sometimes it was knowingly, sometimes it was through ignorance. And as a result, far too many essential workers died or got sick unnecessarily. Many of these jobs were previously invisible and now were understood to be essential. But as Maritza said, calling these workers heroes is not enough. We need to treat them like heroes and we need to protect them. And that is why this legislation, the New York Heroes Act, is so important. We applaud the legislature for passing the bills. We applaud the sponsors of the bills for the leadership they took. And we call on the governor to sign these bills into law as quickly as possible. As New York reopens, it is critical that we reopen safely by protecting workers with enforceable workplace safety rules. And as we have so tragically learned, that must include creating an airborne infectious disease standard to fight this pandemic and whatever comes next. And we also know that workers are the experts and must be empowered through health and safety committees to keep their workplaces safe. The pandemic has not ended, nor have the dangers it creates, nor can we be assured that there will not be other episodes in the future, unknown right now. New Yorkers in every part of our state need this legislation to be signed into law. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart, for your words. And that is right. Workers know what they need, and workers are the ones who were, from day one, engaged in the conversation through this coalition to develop the language of this policy. And let's remember that passing the bill, or actually signing the bill at this point, and if the governor signs, he's signing language that was put forward by workers who are at the front lines, the workers who know better. And some of the workers who have been at the front lines and continue to be at the front lines saving our communities' lives are the workers from the Nurses Association. I'd like to introduce you to Judy Sheridan.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much, Maritza, for all the work that you've done and for everyone else on this call. You know, history's taught us that workers can't simply depend upon their employers to protect them and to treat them fairly. And these are just the facts. Let's think back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Locked exits, poor ventilation, numerous fire hazards were the rule until 146 workers perished in the fire. Then and only then was legislation introduced to prevent future tragedies. Or child labor was frowned upon. Factory owners cried that their businesses would fail if they couldn't continue to exploit children as workers. But public opinion, exposure of conditions, as well as the maiming and death of these kids in unsafe situations led to legislation banning these practices. Unbridled discrimination against people of color, women, immigrants, non-English speakers was rampant until laws were passed, making practices illegal. However, in this case, these practices do continue covered up, hidden, shrouded in other charges. But the law, and importantly, the presence of unions and other advocacy organizations do provide a pathway for justice. Silicosis, asbestosis, black lung, and the life-threatening conditions first responders confronted after 9/11, all of these conditions were the price workers paid to work. Only through legislation were protections afforded after so many lives were lost. It appears that only when human tragedy occurs does society and government act to protect workers and hold employers accountable. And this is the case that leads us to the HEROES Act. How many of our frontline caregivers and workers sickened and died during the COVID pandemic for lack of a safety standard, for precious PPE, and all the other safeguards that have now become part of our social discourse? How many faced retaliation for exposing unsafe conditions? How many workplace policies and practices are generated by bosses in ivory towers who never know what the workplace is like? Well, those of us in the front lines are excluded from having input, of having a say in what's necessary to protect life and limb. This legislation should have existed before the deaths, the illnesses, the tragedies that destroyed the lives of so many workers and our families. But we commend Senator Gianaris and Assembly Member Reyes, my fellow nurse in struggle, by the way, for their persistence and commitment in getting this law through their respective houses as well as the sponsors of the bill, the legislators who voted for it, and the leaders who supported it. It's never too late to right a wrong and to ensure that justice is served. No worker should suffer or die for simply doing her job, but we mourn our dead even while we fight for the living. Now it's up to the governor to ensure that this bill, as it's currently written, becomes yet another pillar in the centuries-long battle for worker justice. Justicia, seguridad y salud para todos los trabajadores. Gracias, thank you.
Gracias, Judy. Así es, justicia para nuestros trabajadores que han estado luchando todos los días para mantenernos con comida, para traernos las cosas que necesitamos. Y por eso vamos a escuchar a los trabajadores en este momento. All of the workers who have been at the front line, setting us, and have been in the fight every day. Hear from some of the workers, and I'd like to introduce you to Teresa Martinez, from the laundry workers. She's a worker who, unlike many other workers, she has also not been as a part of a union and can share us her story. Teresa.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Teresa Martínez. Soy miembro del Centro de Trabajadores de Lavandería. Durante esta pandemia hemos repetido muchas veces lo importante que han sido los trabajadores esenciales y nos han llamado héroes. Y ahora es el momento de que si esta propuesta de ley ya pasó en la Asamblea y en el Senado, estamos demandando que el gobernador Cuomo firme esta ley. Las trabajadoras de lavanderías y de otros sectores no podemos seguir esperando a morir a falta de regulaciones más fuertes que nos protegen. Y hay que recordarle al gobernador que nosotros los trabajadores esenciales fuimos los que mantuvimos esta ciudad funcionando. Y este problema va a continuar porque las vacunas no son lo suficientemente. Por eso, repito, estamos exigiendo que el gobernador firme esta ley. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Teresa. Thank you, everybody. And just as a reminder, remember in the globe in the bottom right, you have for interpretation, either in Spanish or in English. So remember to just click that button if you need interpretation. Thank you, Teresa. Really appreciate your remarks. It is important to remember that this legislation needs to be signed as a way to say thank you to the workers, not only to call our workers heroes, but also to ensure.
I think I am anyway.
What we say. Up next, I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Buckley. She is a nurse and she's a member of CWA in Buffalo.
Hi, yes, I just want to thank everyone, the legislators, workers, and organizers here that made this win possible. Being here this morning brings me back to a year ago when every time I held the handle of a door to a patient's room, I would have an overwhelming flash of what this disease could mean for my 8-year-old daughter or her 70-year-old grandfather. Being in healthcare, many of my coworkers knew in the beginning that the policy of not allowing us to wear masks outside of patients' rooms was probably not safe. We lost John, an X-ray tech at this time last year to COVID-19. He had a dry sense of humor. He always took the stairs, hardly ever took time off, and loved to take his grandsons to lacrosse matches. During the second wave this winter, I was in my second trimester of a high-risk pregnancy, but I don't know if anybody saw, she's fine. But as the supply of the N95s that fit me well dwindled this winter, I felt that same terror, and no worker should have to feel that terror going to work. So this win, thanks to so many of you on this call, means that we're close to having a standard that we as workers can point to what should be happening with COVID or another airborne disease and say, this is how things should be to protect ourselves, our coworkers, family, patients, or customers. And, you know, I really want to extra thank the coworkers that put, you know, their jobs on the line or their comfort on the line to help make this happen through doing things like, you know, stopping traffic with socially distanced protests, car rallies, strikes, or sick outs. And I think it will be so much better if workers can continue to speak up and take action, as they will have to do even if this law passes, but through slightly less difficult things like committees or through their unions. So here we are in Western New York. We're right now experiencing another terrible surge. My coworkers on hospital wards that had gone back to non-COVID designation are getting back to having to wear double masks all day, to watching the loneliness of someone who can barely breathe and might never see their family again. We still need this bill today. And then this is the time for the governor to sign this bill. So please, Governor Cuomo, sign this bill. New York's frontline workers deserve this and more. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. I appreciate all the work that you've been doing through this year and continue to do. Leaders like you can help create this kind of legislation to ensure that we create the enforceable standards necessary for workers today and for the future. Up next, I'd like to also mention that let's not remember that the majority of essential workers are Black, Brown, and immigrant communities, communities that even pre-pandemic have been vulnerable. And this legislation would allow for these workers to have the protections that they haven't done for a really long time. Let's do justice for our workers. And to that end, I'd like to introduce you to Murad Awaded, from the co-executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition.
Thank you, Maritza, and thank you so much to all of our partners here who have fought for the New York Heroes Act. My name is Murad Awada. I am the interim co-executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition. Immigrants and New Yorkers of color have too long faced the impossible choice of maintaining their health or their jobs at great cost to their family security and well-being during the pandemic. More than 1/3 of New York State's frontline workers have been risking their lives to treat those stricken with COVID, stock our grocery shelves, take care of our elderly, pick our produce, and more to keep this state running in a time of crisis. They and all workers deserve to work in safe conditions without fear of reprisal or losing their jobs, whether they work in Manhattan offices or hospitals in Buffalo or the fields of the Hudson Valley. We commend and thank Senator Gianaris and Assemblymember Reyes for their leadership on this issue and urge Governor Cuomo to sign this bill into law immediately. New Yorkers cannot wait, neither can our communities. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to celebrate this huge victory for our workers.
Thank you, Murad. Really appreciate your leadership on this work. And as I'm hearing, as we move along with the agenda, Senator Gianaris is going to be jumping off in a moment just to go to session. So I want to give a really huge applause to Senator Gianaris for all his leadership and all the work from the Senate to get us to where we need to be. Thank you. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. We will continue fighting together, and we'll be in touch with you and your office as things move along. Thank you. Just to continue us with our program, let's not forget about the large corporations in this country who should be doing the right thing, and they're not. They're not because they don't want to actually protect workers. They're not because they want to save money, despite the fact that they have millions of dollars, billions of dollars, I would say. I am talking about Amazon. I'd like to introduce you now to Rena Cumming. Rena Cumming is an Amazon worker who can share with us what her experience has been working in a warehouse during a pandemic and how these corporations are not protecting workers and how this legislation will help ensure that workers are protected permanently moving forward. Thank you, Rena.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Morning, Rena.
Yes, hi. 1 second, let me just get to someplace quieter so I can remove my mask. Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Rena Cummings, and I'm an Amazon worker. I've been working at JFK 8 here in Staten Island since 2018. October, about 2 months after I opened here on Staten Island. I've after 6 months of working at Amazon, I started to see a lot of things that were not right at the warehouse. There was just not a lot of protections for the workers, period. We were treated like cattle. You're tracked every place in the building, and they track how much you work. They actually have a computerized system where you have to log into every department and they constantly track you. Transportation, getting to and from the warehouse is horrible. The bus service, they would not, Amazon does not work with the MTA to make sure that we get a ride, a safe, straight ride to and from the warehouse. Buses were overcrowded, especially during the pandemic. All of these issues was just more exacerbated because of the pandemic. It was kind of just thrown out there. I was there for the worker, Chris Smalls, who he got burned for standing up for workers' rights throughout the warehouse. I remember being at the warehouse March 29th of last year, and there was no protection, no PPE. Not a lot of people was wearing a 1 or 2. And it was just unbelievable how we were selling the items, but it wasn't available for us workers to use. So I was so happy to be a part of this bill and to speak about it and speak up, because I've always advocated for legislature. I've always said that, there are no laws to protect us. We need the government to step in. Other countries like Europe did it, and France. And why not America? So I want to thank everyone who worked on this idea, this bill. I'm so excited. It's like giving birth to a baby, for all of us, So thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your hard work and all your sacrifice.
No, Rena, thank you for being at the front lines, for doing all the work that you're doing. And we know that Amazon must be held accountable. The way we're going to do it is by ensuring that we have this law in place.
Yes. Yes.
We're going to be respecting workers like you who are at the front lines, giving all these services to all of our communities, ensuring that we get all of the basic necessities delivered to us. So thank you for your work, Rena. Up next, I'd like to introduce you to a farm worker, Crispin Hernandez, who similarly has been at the front lines of this fight and continues to be. I want to thank Crispin for his work. All the farm workers are allowing us to have food in our tables. They are making sure that we get food in our tables, and we cannot forget that. Crispin Hernandez, you are next.
Sí, buenos días a todas y a todos. Quiero compartir, ¿verdad? Qué tan importante es para nosotros los trabajadores esenciales lo que es esta legislación, ¿verdad? Quiero empezar en primer lugar, mencionar de que ya tenemos más de un año lo que es la pandemia del COVID-19 y no hay protección para todos los trabajadores esenciales. Por eso, cuando empezó la pandemia, rápidamente empezamos a organizarnos y sobre esta legislación, ¿verdad? Para nosotros es muy importante, ¿verdad? Actualmente yo trabajo con el Centro de Trabajadores aquí en Nueva York Central, pero yo trabajé en la industria lechera, ¿verdad? Tengo mucha experiencia haciendo ese trabajo en la agricultura. Es un trabajo tan intenso, ¿no? Entonces, quiero recordar, ¿verdad? Más bien al público y gracias a los asambleístas y los senadores que han puesto a su trabajo y hacer posible esta legislación. Todos los trabajadores esenciales, a pesar de la pandemia, han arriesgado su vida. Hay muchas familias que tienen sus hijos y dejaron de ir a la escuela y ellos dedicaron a su tiempo, ¿verdad? Trabajando, ¿verdad? Gracias a todos los trabajadores esenciales, principalmente los trabajadores en la agricultura, tenemos alimentos hoy en día. Arriesgando su vida, trabajando 10, 8 horas Por ejemplo, en la industria lechera se trabaja 365 días al año, ¿verdad? Se trabaja en lo que es en la noche, turnos de noche y turnos de día. Entonces, cuando empezó la pandemia, ¿verdad? Quiero mencionar algo muy importante y voy a poner unos ejemplos por qué queremos esta legislación, ¿verdad? Cuando empezó la pandemia del COVID-19, empezaron los trabajadores a ser afectados, ¿verdad? Pero ¿qué pasó aquí? Los patrones no tomaron la responsabilidad, por ejemplo, de proteger a los trabajadores. Muchos patrones no le dieron cubreboca a los trabajadores. Y por eso el trabajo de nosotros como organizaciones que somos individuos voluntarios, hemos entregado cubrebocas a los trabajadores, alimentos, protegiendo a los trabajadores, salvando vida a todos los trabajadores esenciales. Entonces, hasta hoy en día, ¿verdad? Muchos en el lugar del trabajo, a veces ni siquiera no hay un letrero diciendo qué significa COVID-19. Entonces, por eso hay muchos trabajadores que han salido afectados y no es la culpa de ellos, ¿verdad? Tanto los trabajadores tenemos necesidad de trabajar, pero también los patrones nos tienen que proteger en el lugar de trabajo. Eso es muy importante y por eso estamos pidiendo al gobernador, ¿verdad? Ya que esto ya pasó en la Asamblea, en el Senado, que él firme, ¿verdad? Esta ley, ¿verdad? Es muy importante. Hasta hoy en día yo he tenido la oportunidad, ¿verdad?, de hablar con muchos trabajadores y trabajadoras que están muy afectados del COVID. Yo que vivía en mi carne propia haciendo ese trabajo en la agricultura, se siente muy, muy feo, ¿verdad? Escuchar a otros trabajadores que están afectados, ¿verdad? Y que no hay protección. Entonces, es muy importante, ¿verdad? Estamos pidiendo una y otra vez al gobernador que lo firme porque es muy importante. Y quiero recalcar algo muy importante, lo que es por qué queremos a esta legislación y tener voz y voto, más bien, o los trabajadores esenciales en cualquier industria en el estado de Nueva York, que tengan voz y voto. Por ejemplo, ¿verdad? Lo que ha pasado en la pandemia, o los trabajadores o que han pedido cubrebocas, ¿verdad? Y a veces los patrones no lo quieren dar. ¿Y qué es lo que hacen, verdad? O han salido afectados y lo que hacen es exigir a ellos a trabajar. Pero sabemos esta enfermedad ha sido muy difícil, ¿no? Cuando uno sale afectado, debilita esta enfermedad mucho lo que es nuestro cuerpo, ¿verdad? Y estoy hablando de la agricultura, ¿verdad? Que se trabaja ahorita en la industria lechera. Muchos trabajadores trabajan 60 horas o más de 60 horas. Entonces, haciendo este trabajo, se necesita mucha energía, mucha agilidad, lo que es el cuerpo, lo que es uno como humano. Entonces, uno cuando está afectado, uno no tiene la energía de hacer ese trabajo, ¿verdad? De ordeñar las vacas 12 horas, a puchar las vacas, que lleguen a la ordeña, que sean ordeñado. Entonces, eso es muy, muy importante, ¿verdad? Y por eso estamos pidiendo que el gobernador, ¿verdad?, que lo haga lo más pronto posible, esto para salvar a todos los trabajadores esenciales y tengamos algo protegido, ¿verdad? Porque hasta hoy en día hay muchos patrones o empleadores que no están cumpliendo ni siquiera protegiendo a los trabajadores, ¿verdad? Y eso para nosotros, ¿verdad? Es muy importante que los trabajadores sean protegidos y también recordar, ¿verdad?, que hay muchos trabajadores que han dejado su vida, ¿verdad?, en el lugar del trabajo. Muchos de nosotros venimos en otro país, pero realmente somos humanos, ¿verdad? Necesitamos ser protegidos, ¿verdad? Y eso es lo que quiero mencionar y en general agradecer a todos los senadores y asambleístas que han hecho esto posible de nuevo y esperemos que el gobernador firma esta ley muy pronto. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Crispin. Thank you so much, Crispin. Those stories are the stories that the governor needs to hear, because this is not just a legislation that it's created to, as I'm hearing, just affect small businesses or affect businesses. This is a legislation to protect workers and businesses. This is a legislation that will protect permanently to all of us from any potential future diseases. It is critical that we do it. So thank you, Crispin, for saying that. Thank you for joining the call today. And up next, I'd like to actually, first of all, say to the press, for members of the press today, that we do have other speakers other worker stories and folks who are still going to speak. We have about 4 more speakers, so stick around. So if you like to hear what they have to say. Up next, I'd like to introduce you to Kaushal Kambati. He is from the Emergency Medicine Residence from SEIU CIR. He's a member of CIR.
Thank you, Maritza. Yeah, thank you, Maritza. Thank you, Mr. Hernandez, Ms. Cummings, all the workers and leaders on this call. And importantly, thank you to Senator Gianaris and Assemblywoman Reyes for your leadership. Thank you to all the members of the Senate and Assembly for having stood with essential workers like myself, not just called us heroes, and actually passed this act to keep us safe. As Marissa said, my name is Kaushal Kambati. I'm an emergency medicine resident. I work at Jacobi in the Bronx. This past year has been a long one for all of us, not just healthcare workers, but all essential workers who drive New York forward and keep New York moving. Construction workers, taxi drivers, grocers, laundry workers, and beyond. I know that I've seen their faces in my emergency department. I've held their hands as they've heard about their COVID. And I've seen the literal fear in their eyes as they become increasingly weary. A large proportion eventually become. I know for many New Yorkers, getting vaccinated and seeing more and more businesses reopening, it can feel like we're almost through this pandemic. But that really isn't the case. Myself and my fellow healthcare workers, we're still fighting COVID every day, and we're fighting dangerous variants. The vaccine gives us hope, and I urge everyone who is able to get vaccinated, but we need further measures to carry us through to the end of this pandemic and save as many lives as possible. We need real protections for workers that give them the power to stay safe and stop the virus from spreading, and hopefully stopping it from further mutating. With the passage of the New York HERO Act through the Assembly and the Senate, we're almost there. We're standing on the precipice of being the first state to have an enforceable airborne infectious disease standard. That's huge. I'm grateful for CIR, SEIU, and all of the protective workplace committees that have helped champion this act and helped us take care of ourselves as essential workers. Having worked in overflowing emergency rooms during COVID and flu season after flu season, the HERO Act fills me with hope that we'll be able to end this revolving door of COVID patients in our EDs, and hope that we won't see future flus and airborne viruses devastate our essential workers as they do now. Frequently, this past year, we were often forced to choose between wearing appropriate PPE or taking care of the patient in front of us. I don't have a single colleague that I know that wouldn't choose the patient in front of them over not tending to them for a lack of PPE. And I surmise the same is true for any essential worker who takes pride in being the foundation of this state and of this city. As I mentioned, we worked throughout this pandemic in the Bronx, which we know was hit disproportionately compared to the rest of the country and even parts of New York. And as a doctor, I want to make it clear that we don't want to be called heroes. We want to be protected. And that's what we're asking Governor Cuomo to do, to sign this act so he can properly protect us and all New Yorkers and keep them out of our emergency rooms. So we don't have to, hopefully we don't have to go through this again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I agree. Hopefully we don't have to do this again. And with this law, we'll be able to actually provide these protections for our workers permanently. Up next, I'd like to introduce you to another leader of the labor movement who has been at the front lines, protecting their members and working to ensure that workers from the UFCW 2013 can actually speak up for the protections that they need in this workplace and have been engaged in this coalition from the beginning. Mark Caretuno is the president of UFCW 2013. Excuse me.
Morning. Thank you, Maritza. Morning, everybody. Today is certainly a bright spot in what has otherwise been a very dark and tough COVID year. But, we're not across the finish line yet here. We need Governor Cuomo to sign this bill, and we need him to do it now. We need it signed into law. Essential workers, our members, must have enforceable safety standards in order to feel safe and to actually be safe. We owe it to all of these essential workers that have helped us get through this pandemic over the last year. It should not even be a question or an option to not sign this bill into law. These essential workers have been on the front lines every day for us, and it's time for the governor to be there for them and to show them all that we appreciate what they've done and that they matter. Many people and many organizations have worked very hard to get this legislation through and to see it come to fruition, especially those in the Senate and the Assembly. So we thank everybody who has worked so hard on this bill, all the community and labor organizations, and all of the workers for all of their efforts over the last year and continuing to put themselves in harm's way, despite the fact that many people may think this pandemic is over. It is not, as has been said by many of the other folks here on this press conference today. They are fighting every day, seeing variants pop up all over, and we need to make sure that we finish this fight by signing this bill into law. So on behalf of UFCW Local 2013 and all of our members, I thank you all for your efforts. Thank you, Maritza.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we'll continue the fight together because it's really important that labor and community comes together in this moment to fight for what we know is right for our workforce and for our communities. Up next, I'd like to introduce you to Owen Chari, who is an Uber driver, and he's a member of the Retail Action Project. Let's remember that many workers on the Uber and all the gig economy also have not been receiving protections for their employers. And this law will do that, would ensure that these workers have the protections and there is no retaliation to them. So Owen, thank you for joining us. I'll give you the chance to share your story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Senate and the Assembly. We have delivered a huge victory for workers. We have been demanding protection for over a year. I want to thank you. I want to thank them for a big job done. Myself as an Uber driver, I've worked throughout the pandemic, since the beginning of the pandemic. You know so well that we were out there as essential workers when anyone could not be out. We were delivering food, we were offering transport, but our working conditions were horrible. We didn't even have PPEs. We didn't even have cleaning agents to clean our hands. We were exposed to a lot of people per day, like we deal with a lot of people, different people, and exposing our lives. Our companies, Uber, DoorDash, they didn't do much to us drivers. What we could only do is to remit and make them a lot of money, but they were not even investing back in the workers' protection. So I would like to thank all the guys who have set up this bill to finally protect us. We are unsung heroes. You know, to be called a hero is not important when you are not protected. We need Governor Cuomo to sign this bill so that whenever we face a similar pandemic again, we'll be there to stand and deliver and work and continue to make New York safe for everyone. I want to thank you all for this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen, for everything that you're doing and for joining us today. Up next, just because we have a couple of more speakers, I'd like to introduce you to a leader who has been looking at health and safety issues for a really long time to protect workers, even pre-pandemic. I'd like to introduce you to Charlene Obernauer from NICOSH.
Thanks, Maritza. Thanks, everyone. It's good to be with you this morning. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why this bill is so important and what it really does, right? So we're looking at a standard that is on airborne infectious disease exposure prevention. And this is a standard for all work sites. It's differentiated by industry. And it essentially will create a model standard where an employer can look at this model standard and can say, oh, this is what I need to do to protect my workers. Now, in the past, as people have said, this has been guidance. So even though in the best case scenario, the best employers, good employers are following these standards already. We want to make sure that all employers are required to follow them. And so the legislation has passed the Senate, it has passed the Assembly, and it requires things like face coverings, PPE, hand washing stations, cleaning and disinfecting of equipment, effective social distancing. And ultimately, this is what everyone needs to be safe during a pandemic. This is what workers need to be safe during a pandemic. So the next step is that the governor needs to sign the bill. And we're very hopeful that this is going to become a reality for workers in New York State, that the bill is going to be signed and that workers can feel safer and feel like they're going to be healthy when they return home from work, and that they don't continue to have fear about New York reopening and workers going back to work and the pandemic, right? The pandemic that's impacting their everyday lives. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks so much, Maritza. Thanks for everyone for being on.
Thank you, Charlene. Really appreciate it. Up next, last and next, but not least, I'd like to introduce you to Victor Cortez, who is from the Alianza Agrícola, and that will be our last speaker, and then we will take questions from the press.
Hola, buenos días. ¿Sí me escuchan?
Te escuchamos, buenos días.
Ok, mi nombre es Víctor Cortés y soy un líder del grupo de la Alianza Agrícola de acá del área de Rochester. Somos un grupo de las personas directamente afectadas y nosotros decidimos organizar o hacer la Alianza Agrícola porque queríamos ser escuchados ante la sociedad, porque siempre los trabajadores agrícolas y siempre hemos estado a la sombra de todos, y por eso nosotros decidimos organizarnos y ahorita estamos, y más que nada darle las gracias a todas las personas que están atrás de todo este proyecto. Yo sé que para muchos no es fácil, así como para nosotros, porque pues, como ustedes sabrán, nosotros como trabajadores, yo tengo ya 10 años viviendo en el estado de Nueva York y durante esos 10 años he trabajado en lecherías, he trabajado de noche y he trabajado de día, y créeme que es muy difícil para nosotros estar trabajando, y más en estos tiempos de la pandemia. Nosotros no dejamos de trabajar. Entonces yo lo único que le pido al gobernador que tome en cuenta eso, porque es muy importante para nosotros ser escuchados y no depender que otras personas hablen por nosotros, sino que él debe de hablar, escuchar más a las personas que estamos trabajando. Es como esto, yo lo tomo como un presentador de televisión que solamente el que está al frente está hablando, pero no vemos las personas que están atrás de cámaras, y nosotros somos esas personas que estamos atrás de cámaras, porque yo no he visto a alguien que venga, o que un senador o alguien que vaya a un rancho y mire, o a un greenhouse, es muchas cosas, ¿no? A ir a escuchar directamente de los trabajadores, y todo, la leche, las verduras, todo que van a las mesas de los grandes empresarios, grandes personas, eso es lo que nosotros estamos haciendo. Y nosotros no estamos pidiendo que nos regalen nada, simplemente estamos pidiendo que nos den un poquito de lo que nosotros estamos haciendo por el Estado, por el país. Y si es como dicen que somos unos trabajadores esenciales, que entonces que nos los demuestren, que nos pongan que nos hagan saber eso, que nosotros queremos que sentirnos que sí nos respaldan, que no simplemente son palabras, porque muchas leyes solamente son palabras, y al final de cuentas nos ponen más trabas y nunca se hace. Entonces, si ya pasó la primera parte y nomás la única parte que queda es la de él, entonces si él de verdad nos apoya, queremos verlo ahorita, y si de verdad él apoya a la sociedad de migrantes, como dice, pues ahora es cuando se gane el apoyo de toda esa gente, y es gente que en verdad estamos trabajando. Gracias a todos y gracias por venir a hablar. Discúlpenme si ofendí a alguien.
Gracias, Víctor. No, muchas gracias por tu liderazgo, por ser por tu coraje. Gracias por todo lo que estás haciendo por tus compañeros también. Thank you for the courage and thank you for being here, Victor. We appreciate all the work that you're doing on the ground. So that will conclude our program. And just once again, I want to reiterate that our message today to Governor Cuomo is that he has a choice to make. He can clearly do what is right and protect essential frontline workers and businesses by ensuring that the New York Hero Act is signed, or he can leave them vulnerable to more COVID outbreaks, shutdowns, and job losses that will harm all of us. So Governor Cuomo has a choice to be made today, and we believe that the millions and millions of workers who have sacrificed, they need this bill to be passed. So right now, we're gonna open it up to press. Beforehand, I wanted to say a quick chant. When workers are under attack, what do? Unmute yourselves, stand up, fight back. When workers are under attack, what do?
Stand up, fight back.
Thank you for doing that. I would like to open it up for questions.
If you're pressed, please introduce yourself.
Well, since press is a little shy right now, I would like to also make a call to action. On the chat, there is a link. We are asking everybody to take a moment and send a message to the governor. Send a message to the governor, sign a petition, and that will help us ensure that the governor hears that we all want to have this bill passed.
We have a question from Joe Maniscalco, Labor Press. Talk about what happens next. When will the guidelines actually be implemented? Does the governor have the ability to change it before signing? Any industries exempted from the act? Lots of questions.
Would anyone like to answer that question? But I could try to answer this if nobody else wanted to jump in. I think in terms of what's next, essentially this bill will make it so that workers will have permanent protections in the workplace. Guidelines are just not permanent and they're only guidelines. So that will actually make it so that this law will be effective immediately and will allow for workers to have these protections immediately in the workplace. And then the other piece to make note here is that this legislation covers the private sector. The public sector already had a law that was passed. And at this moment, the Assembly needs to send this to the governor. I understand there is a procedural thing that they have to do internally, but that will be coming out in the next day or so. And then there is 30 days for all the standards to be put in place. So it will be basically after the passage of the bill, we have 30 days for the bill to be implemented in the workplace. Now, in terms of if there is amendments, if the governor wants to make amendments, he can make amendments and they will have to go back to the legislature once again to be approved. And then again, the DOL and the DOH have 30 days to release the policy. But I want to reiterate, we don't want amendments in this law. This is the law. We don't want amendments. We work together with the legislature, with communities. This is a large coalition of labor and community groups. It took us a year to develop this policy. So I think the governor has to sign this bill as is. We don't want any amendments. There is no need for it.
Question from Robert Hennelly. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thank you so much for convening this amazing array of individuals. This event is not happening in isolation. New York State has often been the leader. We saw that with the $2.1 billion excluded workers fund. Could Charlene or any of the other experts on the front lines, how does this figure into a situation where we understand that Secretary of Labor Walsh has kind of delayed the OSHA standards? And is there a hope, a fervent hope, that if New York State exercises leadership here, that it could leverage a national awakening on this issue?
Thanks, Bob. That's a great question. And, you know, the emergency temporary standard is something that I think all over the country, workers, worker leaders, unions have been hoping for and have been hoping that we see come through. But by New York taking leadership on this issue, it definitely does set a new standard for other, you know, states to follow suit. But ultimately, it also says something to the federal government, right? To the Department of Labor, to OSHA, to the White House, to really say, this is a standard that is important to workers. This is a standard that we need to see for workers. And I do think that it will make an impact at the national level. And that's definitely something that we're all hopeful for.
May I have a follow-up?
Go ahead.
Okay. So in terms of this now, at this point, if some of the union folks could tell us, this is not a discrete issue in the sense that we know that people have died. We don't know how many really, which is part of the tragedy. And in fact, some employers are concealing this. Are we hearing reports, literature indicates between 10% to 1 in 3 people that get COVID have long-term symptoms. Is this an ongoing issue we need to be concerned about? And does New York State need to reform its worker comp laws? And might we think of having a registry similar to the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund? Because we know in that case, as previous callers discussed, we see disease implications much later in life. If people could address a constellation of those issues. Thank you.
I'm happy to do that, or I can step back if someone else wants to do that.
Go ahead, Charlene, and then we can pass it on to some of our union leaders on the call as well.
Okay, awesome. So the link between what's happening now and what happened with 9/11 is very clear, in the sense that workers who were sick from COVID and workers who were made sick and ill from 9/11 exposure, they are all going to have long-term symptoms. Well, I shouldn't say they all. Many of them will have long-term symptoms. So as you said, about the data is still, you know, a little bit murky, but some amount, I'll say, of workers who had COVID are going to have long-term exposure. So it begs the question, right? What reforms need to be made to the workers' comp system? Does there need to be a registry? Does there need to be a presumption bill, right? Which Jessica Ramos has carried in the New York State Senate. I would say yes to all of these things. Because, you know, the latency period for a lot of cancers after 9/11 was like 20 years, right? And so as an organization that does outreach on the 9/11 health program, I can say that we are continually meeting workers, meeting community members who got sick from 9/11 and who have not yet signed up for the 9/11 health program. So this definitely makes a lot of sense for workers with COVID. And it makes sense, you know, for people who represent workers out there, it makes sense that workers do file for workers' compensation if they did get COVID on the job, because you don't know what is going to impact the worker later on down the line because of the long-term symptoms. So it is good for workers to file. Only 21,000 workers have filed thus far. And we know that many more than that, we estimate 250,000 have gotten sick from COVID. So that's a huge discrepancy in numbers.
Yeah, sorry, I was having some trouble unmuting as well. I can speak to certainly the long-term and downstream effects more so than the workers' comp, but it is something that we are constantly seeing actually now. You know, the number of folks who tested positive, whether it was a month ago or even 6 months ago, coming in with, you know, whether they're stroke-like symptoms, blood clots in other parts of their body. This is certainly something that we're still learning about, because obviously we've only been at this, I mean, not only, but we've been at this over a year now. But, you know, it remains to be seen. But I imagine that, you know, if we're seeing it 6 months down, we're going to continue to see it for several years. So I do suspect there will be a significant portion of folks who tested positive with COVID and were symptomatic who experience long-term sequelae.
Yeah, I just want to add, you know, we have this term called long COVID for people with these symptoms, and we're seeing people who really didn't get very sick but tested positive now having blood clots and other complications that are actually quite serious, having neurological problems, having memory loss, you know, and it's unclear even what happens with women who've been pregnant and contracted COVID. The problem that we're having is when workers attempt to file for workers' comp, the organizations in the hospitals, at least I can speak about the hospitals, I don't know about other organizations, have a legal gatekeeper that rejects all the claims. I mean, their role is to reject every workers' comp claim. So people have to jump through incredible numbers of hoops in order to even qualify for workers' comp. They have to bypass, they have to go through the process of the employer and then bypass them, go through our union, go to workers' comp board, and continue to face roadblock after roadblock of being approved for workers' comp. Initially, we were told, oh, you could have got it from the community. This is not a workers' comp issue, but the statistics really belie that. So we're having a big problem and need support from the workers' comp board to define COVID as a workplace hazard. That is yet another issue that we have to confront, because the very small number of people who've successfully had their cases heard by workers' comp pale in light of probably what's 10 times that amount of people who've just faced these roadblocks. Many people give up after the first try, the second try, or even the third try. So this is a major problem with workers' comp right now, and people are definitely facing long-term effects. So we need to have yet another legislative reform, unfortunately, that's very necessary for workers' comp.
Judy, Charlene, and Kashal. Any other questions from the press? Are there any other questions? And thank you, Robert. Thank you, Bob, for joining us, always following us on our work. Really appreciate all the coverage that you are doing on these important issues. Any other questions from the press? If there is anything, as Patrick just shared on the chat, please email Patrick. There is also Patrick's phone number. We can put you in touch with workers and members of the coalition as well, who can share more about what is happening on the ground while we're looking to pass this important law, actually sign the important law. We are celebrating the passage of the law, we passed it. We got it on the Senate. We got it on the Assembly. Our legislatures is doing the right thing. Our coalition is powerful. This coalition is powerful. The power of people is coming together. And I want to thank you all for everything that you're doing. Now, the next step, please sign the petition that is on the chat. Sign the petition and make sure that you let the governor know how you feel. We must sign this bill. There is no time to wait. Thank you all, and that will conclude our press conference. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and let's keep up the fight. Thank you to all of the workers who are taking time off to join us. Thank you so much.